Conduct Unbecoming by L.A. Witt. Narrated by Greg Boudreaux. Chapter 1. Eric. Dude, Okinawa is a fucking shithole. My cousin Jim's words repeated over and over in the back of my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to give a fuck. Yeah, maybe the place was a shithole like he said. Maybe it was worse. Fine, whatever. Wedged into an uncomfortable seat in coach, equal parts physically and emotionally drained, I watched the map on the screen document every mile the plane had traveled. I couldn't have cared less about the tiny green dot that was my destination. After nearly 24 hours of sitting in airports and flying, with that green dot rapidly approaching, all I could think about was the person I'd left behind. How the fuck was I supposed to get through 3 years living this far from my daughter? The year in Iraq and the other in Afghanistan hadn't even been this daunting. 3 years? When she'd dropped me at the airport this morning, yesterday, and we'd said goodbye, Marie hadn't cried like she did when I left for Iraq or Afghanistan, but she'd had tears in her eyes. Sure, she was excited that I'd given her my car, but that didn't soften the blow by much. The girl could handle a lot, and she could keep herself together better than most people I knew. Like anyone, though, she had her limits. If I knew her, she just made it out of the airport parking garage before she had to pull over and cry. If she made it that far, she did better than me. We could do this, somehow. I'd just try not to think about the fact that by the time we lived on the same landmass again, she'd be 20. I was leaving during her junior year in high school, and I'd be back with just a few months to spare before I could buy her that first beer. I sniffed sharply and swallowed the ache in my throat. Taking a deep breath, I looked at my watch. It was just a few minutes shy of 2300 hours, and my ears had popped twice, so we must have been descending. About fucking time, too. My flight had been delayed a couple of times, and my 21:45 arrival was now scheduled for 23:15. Didn't really matter, though. My body clock was so fucked up from almost an entire day of traveling, I couldn't figure out what time it was or what time I thought it should be. Every time I looked at a clock, my mind went, really? I thought it was... Oh, fuck, I don't know what time I thought it was. Out of curiosity, I opened the window shade and peered outside. Darkness obscured most of the island that would be home for the next 3 years. City lights glittered with considerably less intensity than those of Tokyo or San Diego. Scattered headlights wound between buildings just beyond the airport, and the occasional tiny bobbing light indicated a boat out in the ink-black water. Distant pinpricks of light suggested power lines and cell towers along uneven, maybe mountainous terrain, and faintly glowing areas implied cities and towns extending much farther into the distance than I'd have expected on such a small island. "Trust me, man," Jim's voice echoed in my head. "That place blows. Everything's so Americanized, it barely even counts as living in a foreign country. The people fucking hate us, they can't fucking drive, and oh my God, there is nothing to do." Great. Yet another reason I'd probably finish out this tour just like everyone else who came here. Bored out of my mind, itching to go back to the States, and with a substantially higher alcohol tolerance than I'd ever imagined possible. As if 2 combat tours and my last stateside command hadn't already ratcheted up my alcohol tolerance to unhealthy levels. I exhaled and pulled down the window shade. Didn't really matter what the island or the command were like. This could be the shittiest command in the Navy on the shittiest piece of dirt in the world, and I still wouldn't feel any worse than I did now. 3 years without my kid. It hadn't even been 24 hours, and the distance already hurt like hell. The plane touched down as gently as planes ever do. Smoother than the 3-bounce landing in Narita, anyway. Hell, we could have come in sideways and rolled a few times for all I cared. I was just happy to be on the ground. Even if this was the last place in the world I wanted to be. I followed the other passengers off the plane into the airport. In the terminal, most of the brightly colored signs were in both English and Japanese, but I couldn't comprehend them anyway, so they may as well have been in Swahili, or Martian for as far from home as I felt. I trudged down the walkway with the other passengers, hoping they weren't quite so aimless. Someone must have had half a clue, because at some point we were in baggage claim. Within minutes, the belt started, and one by one, bags appeared from behind the black rubber flaps. It hadn't been a crowded flight, so it didn't take long for my luggage to show up. I picked up my sea bag and slung it over my aching shoulders. With that and my laptop case, I shuffled after the slowly moving crowd of passengers. We'd already cleared customs at Narita, so I went straight from baggage claim to the automatic glass doors that divided arriving passengers from the crowds of people waiting to meet us. I scanned the crowd for my sponsor, the person my new command had assigned to pick me up at the airport and help me get to where I needed to be. Over the next 2 weeks, his job was to help me find a car, get a cell phone, learn my way around the various bases, and check into our command. A guy in civvies and sporting a sandy blonde high and tight stepped out of the crowd. "MA1 Randall?" I extended my hand. "You must be MA2 Dawson." He nodded and shook my hand. "Well, off duty, so call me Chris. In that case, I'm Eric. Well, welcome to Okinawa, Eric." He gestured at my bags. "Need a hand with this stuff?" "Think I've got it. Thanks, though." "No problem." He nodded toward the exit. "This way." I followed him to another set of automatic glass doors, and when they slid open, we stepped outside. My first breath of Okinawa was so thick it almost choked me. I coughed and swore. Chris laughed. "Humidity takes some getting used to." Sure." He led me into a fluorescent-lit parking garage and stopped behind a beat-up silver Toyota. Obviously, he hadn't been kidding when he'd told me about buying a beater instead of dropping serious money on a car. "You're only here for one tour," he said via email a few days ago. "Just buy a piece of shit hoopty ride that runs. It's all you need unless you're into drifting or something." Evidently, he practiced what he preached, because I was pretty sure the rust and salt were the only things holding the car together. He popped the trunk, and the lid squealed on its corroded hinges as he raised it all the way. We loaded my luggage into the trunk, and after he'd slammed the lid, I started toward the passenger side. But Chris stopped me. "Other side," he said. Fatigue and jet lag conspired to keep me from understanding him for a few long seconds. Then I remembered cars were right-hand drive here. I got in on the other side, and as Chris started the car, he said, "You want me to stop so you can get a bite to eat or anything? Or just get you back to the barracks?" "Barracks," I said. "I ate something in Tokyo, and I'm about ready to fucking collapse." He chuckled and turned around to back the car out of the parking space. "I made that trip a few times myself. I know exactly what you mean." As he shifted into drive and started out of the garage, he added, "Just wait till you go back stateside. The jet lag going that way is fucking brutal." "I could think of worse things," I said, more to myself than him. By the time he pulled out of the garage and onto the road, I was already mentally writing up a leave chit so I could fly home. As if they'd grant leave when I was barely feet dry on the island. It'd be months before I could accrue enough leave time to go home, unless there was some kind of emergency. I didn't even qualify for that once-a-year free flight back to the States until I'd been here 6 months. And then it was still a matter of getting leave approved. Leave which I'd burned like it was going out of style when I thought I was staying in San Diego for 3 more years. Leave which would take months to accrue again, so Whoa. The curving road suddenly dumped us on a highway with a view of the city, and this was not the Okinawa I expected. The city of Naha was nothing short of sensory overload. Bright neon signs, most of which were in Japanese, lit up windows and storefronts. Casinos rivaled those on the Las Vegas Strip for their ostentatiously colorful displays advertising huge jackpots, slot machines, and something called pachinko. Buildings didn't quite qualify as skyscrapers, but they cut an impressive profile along either side of Highway 58, suggesting Naha was much more cosmopolitan than I'd anticipated seeing anywhere on Okinawa, and much more alien. The vast majority of signs were in Japanese kanji, which flew right in the face of my cousin's accusation that Okinawa was heavily Americanized. I had taken his comments at face value, and hadn't prepared myself for this. Not that I'd had the opportunity, since I'd gotten slam orders and barely had time to get my shit together to move, but this? This was all so bizarre and weird, and I was completely lost. Dropped in the middle of a place that was a lot more Japanese than it was American, when I'd expected the polar opposite, and unable to shake the feeling that I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. As Chris continued driving, the occasional familiar symbol emerged from the scenery, but even they were alien here. Traffic signals were horizontal instead of vertical. A giant bowling pin was all that gave away the purpose of one brightly lit, kanji-inscribed building, and the golden arches gleamed above some more kanji that presumably spelled out McDonald's. A few blocks later, the red and white likeness of Colonel Sanders stood out from a bunch of incomprehensible signs, though the text on the Kentucky Fried Chicken sign was in Japanese. Even the familiar wasn't. God, this was weird. It was like an alternate universe where everything I knew was skewed and warped into something I didn't recognize, underscoring how lost I felt, how far I was from home, from anything, from anyone. It wasn't my first time in a foreign country. Hell, I'd been to 2 war zones. But every light and every sign in a language not my own drove it home that I was nowhere near Kansas anymore. 1,000,000 miles from everything I knew, surrounded by an alien landscape. I was keenly aware that I was the alien, and I wasn't going home anytime soon. I rubbed my eyes and sighed, then focused again on the strange world around me. Maybe it was an exercise in futility, but I was hell-bent on adapting to this place, getting used to it, making sense of it. And maybe I was just tired, but I could swear I had never seen so many vending machines in my life. Of course, they stood out. While the rest of a particular block might have been dark, the alternately red and white machines glowed with rows of colorful drinks, and sometimes there would be a cluster of 4 or 5 machines. Then half a block later another one, or another cluster. Am I losing my mind? Am I imagining all these vending machines? I asked. Chris laughed. Nope, they're everywhere. Just wait until you see one out in the sticks. I've seen them next to sugarcane fields, in cemeteries, all over the place. He gestured at what appeared to be a convenience store with a green, white, and blue sign that read, Family Mart. You'll see shitloads of those, too. Well, at least I wasn't losing my mind. Yet. After a while, the scenery changed. The flashing, glittering lights faded. Buildings weren't as tall, maybe 2 to 3 stories at most, and weren't packed together quite so tightly. Along the right side of the road, a chain-link fence with 3 strands of barbed wire across the top lined the sidewalk. A base, I guessed. We here already? Already? Jesus, I'd been traveling for at least the better part of 24 hours. Already my ass. Chris shook his head. Nope. Kadeena's further up. This is Camp Foster. Next base is Lester, and then after that is Kadena. Great. I hoped when he said further up he didn't mean more than a few miles. That again, this island was the size of a potato chip crumb. If we drove much further, we'd wind up on the mainland or something. Scanning as much of my surroundings as I could see, though, it occurred to me that while the island looked tiny on a map, it was a good-sized chunk of land in person. I wasn't sure how small I'd expected the place to be, but I couldn't help thinking it was bigger than I thought it would be. Big, small, didn't matter. I was stuck here. No turning back, no early parole. There might as well have been a fence all the way around the island's perimeter, keeping me here, until the Navy was damn good and ready to let me out. Who knew a landmass could be so fucking claustrophobic? This is Kadena. Chris drew me out of my thoughts as he turned off the highway and pulled up to a base gate. "You'll be staying on this base until you find permanent housing." "How far is this from White Beach?" He shrugged. 10 or 15 clicks? I raised an eyebrow. "And I'm staying here even while I don't have a car?" "I'll be driving you until you get your car and license," he said. "Don't worry about it." He rolled down the window. The sentry took our IDs, looked them over, then handed them back and wordlessly waved us through. At the barracks, I checked in and we took my bags up to my room. Then Chris left for the evening, and I could finally settle into something that wasn't a hard plastic chair in a terminal or a sardine can seat on a plane. It was oppressively hot outside, and the air conditioning in my room was like an icy slap in the face. Naturally, there was no adjusting the AC. It was either on or it was off, and with the heat outside, I didn't dare switch off the cold air. Lovely. I'd have to bundle up in my room and strip down to shorts and a t-shirt whenever I went outside. It was only temporary, though. When I finally found a more permanent place, it would damn well have adjustable AC or I'd install it my fucking self. As for tonight, sleep. Sweet, sweet, no longer crammed into a damned plane sleep. I had just enough energy left for a desperately needed shower. Once I'd dried off, I turned on my laptop long enough to tap into the barracks Wi-Fi and sent emails to my daughter, ex-wife, and ex-boyfriend to let them know I'd made it safely. Then I closed my laptop and left it next to my sea bag on one of the beds. As I did, a couple of travel brochures that had been fanned across the table caught my eye. Though I was so exhausted I could barely see straight, curiosity got the best of me, and I picked them up. Golf, hiking, boating, snorkeling. Well, that was promising. At least there was something here I enjoyed. If the snorkeling was anything like Hawaii or Guam, then maybe I could get through this 3-year tour without completely losing my mind. I tried not to think about that number, but it just kept banging around in my head. 3 years in this foreign place where I didn't even know how to drive or how to speak the language. 3 years without my daughter. 3 fucking years. I tossed the brochures aside. Only I could find a reason to be depressed after looking through pictures of turquoise water and colorful fish. But the promise of snorkeling didn't quite make up for everything else on my mind. Lying back on the hard barracks bed, fingers laced behind my head, I should have fallen asleep in seconds. I should have been out cold before I even hit the pillow. But I was exhausted to the point of restlessness. I teetered on the brink of thinking myself into insomnia or crying myself to sleep. Again. It didn't help that my options were limited when it came to making friends on this island. Even finding someone to go snorkeling with once in a while promised to be a challenge, because the military was ridiculously restrictive about fraternization. As an E6, I couldn't hang out with E5s or below without risking disciplinary action, and the E7s and above had to be careful spending time with my pay grade or below. That, and if the chiefs were anything like the ones at my last 3 commands, I could pretty much rule out the E7s and above anyway, unless I wanted to go to the brig for kicking someone's ass. So, it was E6s or nothing. E6s who were usually married, which meant family get-togethers instead of hanging out with single guys. Well, unless they were golfing, and of course, I didn't golf. If making friends would take an act of Congress, I had a sneaking suspicion it would also be 3 years before I could get laid on a regular basis either. And fucking forget any kind of relationship. Most Americans on Okinawa were military, which meant if I wanted to date, casually or otherwise, I had to fish off the company pier. Even with the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that was never a wise career move. But unless I learned to speak Japanese, I didn't have much choice. I was a single, gay E6 on an island where nearly every American was military. I didn't golf, I wasn't a huge drinker, I didn't speak a lick of Japanese, my kid was an ocean away. Reality started sinking its teeth in. I tried to blink away the sting in my eyes, tried to ignore that pressing ache in my throat. but with each passing moment the scales tipped more and more in favor of crying myself to sleep. Again. No two ways about it, Eric. The next 3 years are going to be very, very lonely. The next 2 weeks were occupied with the delightful process of finding my sea legs in a new command. There was the usual endless stream of paperwork, headache, and more paperwork, my favorite part of the military. I was assigned a duty section of about a dozen other masters-at-arms, Navy police like me, and was made watch commander. By the end of it all, I was settled in at work, had a piece of shit car, and a nice apartment a few kilometers off base, and still missed my daughter so bad I couldn't see straight. Day in, day out, getting to know strangers at a professional arm's length. Then I'd go home to an apartment building full of people who were lovely and polite, but there was a mile-wide language barrier between me and every one of my neighbors. 15 minutes here and 5 minutes there talking on the webcam with my ex-wife or my parents. An hour every couple of days with Marie. My plane had long since landed, but the distance just kept growing the more I realized I was here and she was there, and that wasn't changing any time soon. My skin crawled from the lack of human contact. Real, genuine human contact. Something that wasn't filtered by regulations and geography. On my third Friday night in town, Chris offered to take me out to dinner with his wife and some guys from work, but I bowed out. All my things had arrived yesterday, I'd told him, and I still needed to unpack. Forget unpacking. I was itching to find something to do. Who was I kidding? I didn't want something to do. I wanted someone to do. I couldn't think of anything else to alleviate this craving, or at least distract me from it for a while. Sitting on my couch with my feet up on a box of something I hadn't bothered unpacking, I balanced my laptop on my knee and opened up my browser. More than once while I'd lived in temporary lodging, I'd been tempted to look up certain aspects of Okinawa's nightlife. But, rational or not, I was terrified someone would find out. Not that I was one of those tinfoil hat wearers who was convinced Big Brother was constantly peering over my shoulder. But my time in the military had given me a healthy respect for the need to be extra, no measure is too paranoid discreet about some parts of my personal life. Especially in a place like this, where any man I fucked probably carried a military ID. Safely on my own off-base Wi-Fi, I searched. The search engine brought up a few places that didn't pique my interest. One catered almost exclusively to locals, and I wasn't familiar enough with Okinawan customs to venture into that realm yet. Another was on the off-limits list because the bartenders had been busted selling spice, a synthetic form of marijuana that was a huge problem here. A third had some attractive photos and looked like it was easy to find, but a few people had posted reviews saying it was more of a hangout for members of the Yakuza crime syndicates than a place to meet other guys. Not a good place for a cop to show his face, never mind trying to get laid. Ah, but what was this? Palace Habu. It was down an alley off Gate 2 Street. Of course it was. I'd heard that the majority of the nightlife for Americans on this island existed along that several-block stretch of clubs, shops, and restaurants just outside Kadina's Gate 2. And being down an alley wasn't unusual either. Apparently the alleys and side streets here were not only safe, but brimming with places to eat, shop, and party. For that matter, dangerous or not, the fact that Palace Habu was down an alley meant it was harder to see from the main road. Always a bonus when I didn't want anyone I worked with to know where I was spending my evening. I printed the directions, then looked up the number for a taxi to take me from my apartment out by White Beach, which was the base I was attached to the legendary Gate 2 Street. Half an hour later, I was in a cab and on my way. Gate 2 Street certainly lived up to its reputation as party central. The street was choked with cabs, and nearly everyone on the sidewalks was obviously American and military. Bright neon signs blazed above shops, clubs, and tattoo parlors, trying to draw people in to spend their freshly deposited paychecks. Signs advertised the beers on tap, especially Orion, a local beer that was wildly popular among Americans and Okinawans alike. Maybe one of these days I'd go exploring and check out the rest of this street. But not tonight. I had a destination, something I needed, and that was final. In front of a clothing store, which the website had said to use as a landmark, the cabbie let me out into the sticky, humid night. From there, according to the directions in my hand, I was supposed to face the store, then turn to my left until I saw a sign with a cartoon monkey on it. What is this, a scavenger hunt? Certain I was about to end up on some form of candid camera, "Hey look, another clueless new guy fell for it," I faced the store and turned to my left. Sure enough, on the corner of another building about 20 feet away was a weather-beaten sign with a cartoon monkey. The directions indicated I was to go down that alley. I paused at its entrance, looking down the narrow, mostly empty gap between the two buildings. Everyone had said Okinawa had little to no violent crime, so it was reasonably safe to go to places like this. But instinct is instinct, especially when that instinct has been fine-tuned by 16 years as a cop. I checked the directions one more time, then I glanced around the street and sidewalk in search of any familiar faces that might recognize mine. If any of my guys were here, looking for the booze and tale that drew everyone to Gate 2 Street on Friday nights, I didn't see them. Hopefully that meant they didn't see me either. Taking a deep breath, I started down the alley. Numerous doors lined the brick walls, and thumping music came from behind several of them, adding an irregular, echoing heartbeat to the otherwise quiet alley. About 40 feet from the street, I found the door I was looking for, the one marked Palace Habu. I went inside and followed a dark stairwell up to a windowless, black-painted door with a similar sign. I put my hand on the doorknob, which vibrated with the music on the other side, and closed my eyes. Going into a gay establishment in a new city was always unnerving, especially if there was a significant military population. It didn't matter how often I told myself that if someone saw me in this place, that meant they were there for the same reason, and thus wouldn't be inclined to rat me out. And even if they did, I couldn't get kicked out for being gay now. Still, I didn't want people to know. Bad for the career, shitty for the work environment. But no one would know. They wouldn't know I was here, they wouldn't know how badly I needed to share a bed with someone tonight. And what they didn't know wouldn't hurt me. I glanced to the left, I glanced to the right, another deep breath, and I pushed open the door. Chapter 2. Shane. When he walked into Palace Habu, I sat up so suddenly I almost choked on my beer. He'd never been here before, that much was immediately obvious. Maybe he was new to the island, maybe he was just new to the club, but he had that bewildered, fish-out-of-water look on his face of someone venturing into someplace unfamiliar. Couldn't really blame him. I'd given the place the same sweeping, disbelieving look when I stepped through that door a little over 6 months ago. Palace Habu was pretty much designed for sensory overload. Flickering lights, bright colors, music videos playing on 6 different flat-screen televisions. A fog machine kept the air opaque on one side of the room, but an industrial-strength air conditioner prevented the place from getting too humid. Whether or not it was deliberate, the gaudy, retina-searing sensory overload made it difficult for newcomers to make out those of us who were already in the bar, whereas a strategically placed spotlight made sure we all got a good, clear view of every man as he came through that door. In other words, if my commanding officer came waltzing in, I had a chance to make myself scarce before he saw me, which meant this new guy couldn't pick me out of the onslaught of flicker-shadow flicker, but I could see him. Oh, God, could I see him? He was obviously military. Of course he was. The vast majority of Americans on this island were, but he wore it even in civvies. The high and tight haircut was neat, but his dark hair was grown out enough on top to suggest he knew how far he could push the regulations. Even as out of place as he was, he didn't give off much of a nervous vibe. He just looked like someone processing unfamiliar surroundings. He still had confident shoulders and fearless eyes, still carried himself like the kind of man who didn't get intimidated, but would look another man square in the eye even if he was intimidated. He was the perfect combination of squared away and arrogant. Not enough of the former to be uptight, just enough of the latter to be irresistibly attractive. He must have been a pilot. They always carried themselves like that, and pilots were, as a rule, hot as hell. I moistened my lips. God, please don't be meeting someone here. That wasn't likely. Men didn't come here to meet someone with whom they'd already crossed paths. No one came here just to hang out, and no one came here on dates. This wasn't a watering hole, it was a hunting ground, and on an island where attractive gay men were difficult to find, a man had to move quickly if he saw something he wanted. My head wasn't the only one that had turned when he walked in, and I'd be damned if anyone else got to him first. So when he started through the crowd toward the bar, I flagged down the bartender. Gesturing toward the newcomer, I said, "Kono hito no ban wa ore no okori." Loosely translated, whatever he's drinking, it's on me. The bartender, a balding local in a red Hawaiian shirt, grinned and said something I didn't catch over the music. Then he smiled and sidled down the bar toward the newcomer. Over my drink I watched, pretending the moisture on my palm was from the ice-cold glass of Orion in my hand. At the bar, the newcomer stopped, probably poised to order a drink, but then did a double-take and looked past the bartender. His lips parted. Yep, he was new to the island. Everyone had the same "what the fuck" reaction when they saw Habu Sake for the first time. It was, after all, a little unusual to walk into a bar and see a row of jars containing equal parts transparent amber liquid and angry-looking coiled snake. He shook his head and returned his attention to the bartender. He placed his order, and while he waited for his drink, let his gaze drift to the Habu Sake again. Grinning to myself, I wondered what he'd say if I suggested doing a couple shots of the stuff. No, Connolly, don't get ahead of yourself. Meet the guy first, then see what kind of shots he's willing to do. The bartender slid the glass across the bar, and I held my breath as he put up his hand to reject the 1,000-yen bill that came his way. He gestured toward me, and the newcomer's head slowly turned. Through the fog-thickened air and the crazy lights our eyes met. He raised his glass and inclined his head, a vague smile forming on his lips. I returned the gesture. He broke eye contact as he took a drink, and I loosed a couple of curses that just got lost in the music anyway. But then he set the glass down, collected the yen he'd tried to use, and slipped the bill back into his wallet. After he'd put his wallet in the pocket of his khaki shorts, he picked up his drink and started toward me. Blood pounding in my ears, I casually hooked my foot around the leg of my bar stool just to anchor myself in place. As he neared me, his features sharpened and came into focus, like a developing Polaroid. High, smooth cheekbones, disarming blue eyes, lips that were probably always just on the verge of either a smirk or a devilish grin. And just like that, some motherfucker with a death wish stepped into the 5-foot gap between us and cock-blocked me. I ground my teeth, glaring at the guy's back. They both made a few small, casual gestures, as people do when making conversation, so I swore into my drink and turned back toward the bar. I wasn't the type to give up easily, especially when I saw someone who intrigued me like this, but there was just enough of a wobble in the intruder's posture to suggest he'd had a hell of a lot to drink. I was in the mood to get laid, not get into a bar brawl, and I had more than enough experience with rowdy drunks to leave well enough alone. No one in this place needed the JPs, Japanese police, breaking up a fight and calling all our chains of command. Oh, but for a man that attractive, I had to admit it was tempting. I took another drink and looked up at the backlit jars of Habu Sake. The flickering strobes and wild disco lights rippled over the motionless, coiled snakes, which at least gave me something to look at, besides someone else moving in on the guy who'd caught my attention like no man had in I didn't know how long. Shit, maybe I was just way too horny for my own good tonight. It had been a while, after all. Maybe it was just that relentless itch to let some willing stranger distract me from how long it had been since the last willing stranger. But no, it was definitely him. Those eyes, that face, that bold, I'm completely in control way he carried himself in spite of being someplace unfamiliar. That every fucking thing about him. Even from halfway across the room, the man didn't just radiate sex. He radiated the kind of sex I'd been dying to have. Fuck my life. Probably just as well someone had intercepted him. A man that hot, after I hadn't slept with anyone in months, we were liable to break Movement beside me turned my head, and in a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. From just inches away, so close he could touch me if he wanted to, he shot me a mouth-watering, asymmetrical grin. Hi. I cleared my throat and managed a strangled, hi. Up close he was even more attractive. His features were sharp in all the right places, smooth in all the others, and the flickering and flashing lights didn't even try to take the edge off the intensity of his blue eyes. He paused, then set his glass on the bar beside mine. Thanks for the drink. He extended his now free hand. I'm Eric. Shane. Holding his gaze, I shook his hand and... Oh my God, I want you. Heat rushed into my cheeks, and I was thankful for the club's lighting, which hopefully hid any new color in my face. Desperate for some sort of conversation, I said, You new to the island? He laughed, which did all kinds of weird shit to my blood pressure. With an expression that was probably as close to shy as he was capable, he looked at me through his lashes. Is it that obvious? I smiled. Nothing to be embarrassed about. Culture shock's just part of the experience. Yeah. He looked around the bar, then sniffed as he raised his drink almost to his lips. So much for the whole place being all Americanized and shit. Someone fed you that crap, too? I shook my head and laughed, pretending I wasn't, holding on to my glass and the edge of the bar for dear life. For all the bullshit people told me before I came here, you'd think we were talking about two different places. He eyed me. So the things people say, they're not true? If they told you the place was boring, Americanized, or a dump, then no, they're not true. Interesting, he said, more to himself than to me. Trust me, I said. This place is awesome. You just have to, get off the fucking bases and go check it out. Is that right? He rested his elbow on the bar. So what else haven't I been told about this island? I don't suppose anyone mentioned the castles? His eyebrows shot up. Castles? No, I can't say they did. I chuckled. Didn't you do any homework before you came out here? He rolled his eyes and gave me a good-humored scowl. I got slam orders. Forget researching the place, I barely had time to schedule a pack-out. I grimaced. Oh, ouch. Yeah. He took a drink, holding my gaze over the rim of his glass. As he set it down, he said, So, castles? Do tell. Thank God for that easy conversation piece. Nothing like a bunch of 14th century castles to give us something to talk about, while I tried to get used to just being this close to him. My heart pounded all the way through the stories of exploring the ruins of Katsuren, Nakakusuku, Shuri, and Nakijin castles. When he asked about some of the hiking trails, the legendary aquarium, and the Japanese Navy underground headquarters, I had to ask him to repeat himself. I blamed it on the loud music, which was a convenient enough excuse. He didn't need to know I was too distracted by thoughts of what he could do with his mouth to understand the words those perfect lips formed. All through the conversation, one thing neither of us brought up was work. We both had the posture and haircuts, and we were both Americans on Okinawa. The vast majority of men who came to the island were military, and Palace Habu may as well have been a gay officers' club. That answered any questions either of us might have cared to ask about what we did, and the less we knew about each other's jobs, the less anyone here might overhear anything. In fact, right now, I didn't give a shit what he did for a living, and I'd have bet money he didn't care what I did. If I wanted to talk about work, I'd be out with my buddies from work. And all the while, as we talked about the island and everything it had to offer, I still couldn't quite find my equilibrium. The things this man did to my head were unreal. Especially since I was right about one thing. Eric didn't shy away from eye contact. Not at all. And the more he held my gaze, the harder it was for me to hold his. Captains and admirals couldn't get a flinch out of me, but he had me seeking refuge in my drink like a nervous kid. After a while, as they often do, the conversation reached a lull. One of those moments where neither of us was in any hurry to leave, but we didn't know each other well enough to know which direction to take the conversation. I surreptitiously tapped my fingers on my knee beneath the bar, trying to figure out my next move. Some guys liked dancing. Me, I preferred to wait on breaking a sweat until the clothes had come off. Eric threw a few glances toward the dance floor, but most guys who were itching to dance couldn't help keeping time with the music. Tapping a foot, drumming fingers, nodding to the beat. Not Eric. Wherever we went from here, the dance floor wasn't it. Eric gestured at my drink, which was almost empty. Refill? Yeah, sure. He smiled. Hey, it's on me this time. He flagged down the bartender and ordered us a couple of drinks. Silence once again set in, and it didn't help that the music was getting progressively louder. This place never got extremely crowded, but more guys had arrived since Eric showed up, and there would probably still be more. More people, more music, more noise. I glanced at Eric. Maybe out here in the loud, wild open wasn't the best place to continue this conversation. With a sharp but subtle nod, I indicated the other side of the room. Want to grab a booth? It's quieter over on that side of the club. Sure. He picked up his drink. Lead the way. Most of the booths were occupied, but we found an empty one near the back. I slid onto the bench and Eric followed. Though we were still in public, the high walls on three sides of us offered the appearance of complete privacy. We may as well have been alone now, and if not for the murmur of voices straining to be heard over the thumping music, I might have convinced myself we were. You're right, he said. It is quieter back here. Thank God, I said. You know this club pretty well, I'm guessing, he asked. Well enough. You come here a lot? I laughed. At the risk of sounding like a complete whore, probably more than I should. An unreadable thought narrowed Eric's eyes and raised one corner of his mouth. So, you probably know all the little games people play between buying the first drink and getting into bed, don't you? I gulped. He was certainly direct. Yeah. You could say I've played them a few times. I reached for my beer because my mouth had suddenly gone dry. After I'd taken enough of a drink to moisten my parched tongue, I set the glass on the tiny table. These booths were more bench than table. I wondered if the designers had the same idea I did for how to put such a booth to good use. I wondered if Eric had the same idea. Meeting his eyes, I said, You know those games pretty well yourself, then? I do. He absently swirled his drink, ice cubes clinking against the sides of the glass. And to be honest, I hate playing them. So much for my mouth not being dry. I coughed into my fist. Do you now? He nodded, and held absolutely rock-solid, unwavering eye contact as he said, Let's just say, when it comes to things like this, I'm more of a shortest distance between 2 points kind of guy. A quiet laugh parted his lips and sent my pulse into the stratosphere. Higher still when he added, Leaves more time to enjoy the destination, don't you think? God damn, but he was aggressive. Usually I was the forward one, I was the one who bought a drink for a guy before he even made it to the damned bar. I sure as fuck wasn't the one who broke eye contact first or waited for the other guy to make a move. I was never caught off guard when someone all but brazenly suggested we go someplace else and fuck, because I was usually the one who said it. I wasn't used to someone who was easily as aggressive as I was, almost to the point of intimidating. I wasn't used to it, but I liked it. I moved closer to him and draped my arm across the back of the bench. Before I could even speak, Eric's eyes flicked toward my arm, then met my own, and the grin on his lips said nothing if not, "That the best you got?" Oh, so it's going to be like that, is it? In one smooth motion, my arm was around his shoulders. He broke eye contact long enough to watch his own hand deposit his glass on the table, and as he looked at me again, his now free hand went to my leg. I cleared my throat just to get some air moving. So are you suggesting you prefer to skip everything between point A and point B, and go directly to point B? His hand drifted farther up my thigh. Abso-fucking-lutely. If I thought his eyes were intense when they locked on my own, they damn near liquefied my spine when they flicked to my lips, then met mine again. It didn't take a genius to figure out what he was thinking, and I didn't doubt I wore the exact same thoughts on my sleeve. We both knew where this was going, and now we stared each other down, our eyes issuing silent dares to make the next move. I let my gaze flick to his lips. The corner of his mouth rose slightly, bringing that almost there grin to life, and sending a shiver right through me. And then we made eye contact, and we both moved in for the kill. Our lips met, and everything was still. The club pulsed and flickered around us, but here in this booth, nothing moved except my pounding heart. Slowly we eased into motion, wrapping our arms around each other as I dragged my lower lip across his. Eric's hand continued up my inner thigh, and I was sure he intended to tease my painfully hard cock through my shorts. Instead, though, he lifted his hand, then let his fingers drift up the front of my shirt, catching every button on the way up, like a silent countdown to making contact with my neck. 3. His fingers snagged just below my collar. 2. Eric parted my lips with his tongue. 1. Warm skin grazed the side of my throat. I closed my eyes and shivered, and Eric took advantage of my being off guard just long enough for him to shove me up against the back of the booth. His kiss went from still and calm to desperate and violent, and I raked my fingers through his hair, returning his kiss with equal ferocity. We both drew sharp, rapid breaths that hissed over the music. God damn. I wanted to take him someplace private, but I didn't want to stop. Not long enough to stand up, get a cab, go somewhere else, and start all over again. I was hard-pressed to think coherently right now, never mind to stop kissing Eric. His mouth was vaguely sweet with the drink I'd bought him. It was something strong, that much was for certain, though I couldn't identify it. I didn't imagine a man like him needed much liquid courage. But if he did, he certainly used it well. He held the back of my neck with an unforgiving hand, pressing his fingers in just enough to order me to banish any thoughts of pulling away. As if pulling away was an option. His deep, demanding kiss was fucking addictive. I slid my hand over the front of his shorts, and he whimpered into the kiss, pushing his erection against my palm. His hand materialized over the back of mine, pressing it even harder against his cock as he kissed me hungrily. Goosebumps prickled every inch of my skin as blood pounded in my ears. I grabbed his hair and pulled his head back. He groaned, then gasped when my lips met the hot flesh of his throat. He dug his fingers into my back, and we both pressed against each other as I kissed up and down the side of his neck. He wore some kind of spicy cologne, and it overwhelmed my senses. On some visceral level, I recognized it. I'd smelled it before. Whatever association I might have had with that cologne, and some other memory was erased, though, at least for now. All it said to me now was, Eric. I'm breathing Eric. The thought of inhaling that spicy Eric cologne while I was deep inside him drove me out of my mind. I couldn't wait, not another goddamn minute. We had to get out of here, or we were going to end up fucking in the men's room. I was used to men who balked at my aggression, not someone who saw my offer of a drink and raised me a blatant comment about skipping the games and cutting to the chase. I usually had to rein it back to keep from scaring a guy away. Not Eric. He gave as well as he took. Hell, if I knew if he was a bottom, a top, or if he... Please, God, please, switched. But I didn't really fucking care. I had to get this man into bed. I brought my head up and just before our lips brushed, said, What do you say we get the fuck out of here and get to point B?